even if you don't have any capacity to do anything to prepare, if you can't afford a bug out bag, let's say you live in the city someplace, I don't know, in Indonesia or someplace that's right in the middle of our daily earthquake watch zone. Just the idea that you might be involved in a 6 or 7 magnitude earthquake, stepping out the front door and looking up and see if there's going to be a possible gargoyle falling on your head that weighs 7,000 pounds or not, can make a huge difference. Just the idea that you're going to panic a little bit less than somebody that you're trying to save because you had some idea something was going to happen.
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time, cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the Grand Solar Minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I have with me Daniel Nigro. You know him as SmAshomAsh. Information about the Grand Solar Minimum, and what I found so fascinating about his channel was the description of the solar wind, because these changes that we're seeing with our sun as it goes into a lower activity state, that solar wind is a complete component of what's happening. Rolf Witche talks about it, David Lapointe talks about it, Daniel talks about it. So explaining some solar wind, no solar wind, it's very apparent as it goes through the daily space weather. So Daniel, thank you for joining me today. We had so much to talk about in the pre-discussion and writing back and forth over these last months. So good to have you on the show, and hopefully we can boil it down and some more easy to understand terms of what's happening in the way the sun's changing and the way that affects our Earth's climate, and then kind of what we can look forward to moving out into 2025, 2024, something like this. The floor is yours. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. I mean, I'm glad to hear that you're interested in the videos. You're perhaps learning something about the sun you didn't know, and the most importantly, letting people know what the data means, how things relate to each other. It's very complicated. You show somebody a magnetosphere movie and they go, "What is that?" And you tell them it's the Earth, and they go, "I had no idea that was going on." They don't necessarily know how that stuff relates to things like their weather. I mean, I've had comments on people who have weather channels and said, "Hey, check out my space weather video." And they're like, "The sun has nothing to do with weather." It can be a tough slog. The IPCC 5 data versus the IPCC 6 data is going to be totally insane because there's practically no solar forcing variables. And I know Ben Davidson's got a good list. There's about 15 known solar forcing variables that aren't in the current climate models. So that's an issue. Now, regarding what solar cycle 25 will be like, that's a tough one. There's a lot of different analyses of this, and there's a lot of different cycles that are overlapping at the same time. So it's very tough to say. You got to look at things like magnetic seismology, and it's not just the counting of the sunspots that figures into it. There's a whole lot going on at the same time. And I started studying the sun about 2003. That was when I kind of discovered things like coronal mass ejections and coronal holes and stuff. And even back then, actually, a lot of solar forecasters were predicting a grand solar minimum back then. It's tough to call. And actually, we're in a rising state of the North Polar field right now on the sun. This is kind of crunch time in a lot of ways as we look at those magnetic fields and try to figure out what's going to happen next.
Yeah, that's true. There's so much variability from NASA to independent researchers and forecasters out there.
Exactly.
John Casey is saying 50 sunspots or less, yet NASA is putting it up there around 100. So, that's almost double from one of the experts on the planet. So where do we go? The amount of solar activity that we get out of this one is going to determine truly how much food we can grow on the planet moving forward. And that's correct. The reason I do my channel, and then we overlap here because the sun does control all these changes that you're seeing on the planet happening at the moment. And if you thought changes like these were limited to today's world, the fate of Rome, climate, disease, and the end of an empire. This book is a sweeping new history of how climate change and disease helped bring down the Roman Empire. An interweaving grand historical narrative with climate science, the fate of Rome was decided not by emperors, soldiers, and barbarians, but also volcanic eruptions, solar cycles, climate instability, and devastating viruses. There's many that are saying perhaps it's a heavier, more powerful cycle intertwined and going to override this 400-year cycle, but it is all about the cycles that are intertwining, and it moves through history again and again and again. I think that's why the ancients were so focused on the repeating cycles of the heavens and the constellations, because there we go, and here it comes again.
Exactly. And, determining how the solar polar fields are derived is kind of a mystery. I mean, if you take a geology class, they're going to tell you that the Earth's magnetic field is generated by a molten sea of liquid nickel and iron underneath the surface. And ultimately, you don't need that stuff to have the magnetic field that we have. All you need is a magnet moving through a magnetic field. And when you take into consideration that all you have to be doing is moving on a magnet through the sun's magnetic field to have a magnetic field via the Hall effect, you're going to realize that the sun could be doing the same thing. So perhaps there's no way to even tell by looking at anything within our solar system what the sun is going to do next. There's a thing called the local chimney, which is kind of the plasma filament, plasma tube, or you could say magnetic filament, or you could say electric current line that the sun seems to be moving on around the galactic center. It's very difficult to be able to tell what's going on with that, because when you look at a magnetic field in space, if there's a magnetic field behind it, you will not be able to see it, or it will at least look distorted, because magnetic fields obscure other magnetic fields.
And we get into the Taurus formation, and you really wonder how far this does go out, because we're not alone just with our solar system. So then other stars connected to, and then how far does that connect, this interwoven web, and then the galaxies connecting to each other. And who knows if these galaxies are affecting each other, that we get down into our regional neighborhood here, if you will, on the spiral arm. And then, the ancients had mapped this out a couple 100 million years to transit around, get back to the start point, where if you were going to transit around the entire Milky Way galaxy 200 million years above and below the ecliptic. I mean, how many changes would there be, and how many effects from much farther out? We're talking hundreds, if not thousands of light years.
Exactly.
Of effects would come back and stimulate where we are. It's really interesting. A butterfly's wings, if you will, on our own planet can cause a hurricane on the other side of the world. Well, what happens if a Birkeland current decreases its output flow in a different part of the galaxy?
Exactly. And not even only that, but also in different galaxies. For instance, Cygnus A. Cygnus A is a giant, ultramassive radio galaxy. And from our perspective on Earth, it's the second most powerful radio source in the sky. It's 700 million light years away. The Milky Way galaxy is only like 125,000 light years in diameter. So this thing is that far away, and we get stronger radio signals from a different galaxy than we get from our own galactic core. This stuff is so interrelated, and there are so many variables, that I'm a firm believer in things like Cygnus X3, the other end of the precessional cycle pole star Deneb, the tail of the swan. I talk about it all the time. One of the most reliable cosmic ray sources in the entire universe. Now, the distance of that thing is questionable. We're not exactly sure how far away it is, because we're looking right down one of the Z fields. We're looking right down the pole of it. Basically, if you've been living in the northern hemisphere, this thing has been sending actual particles through your head for your entire life. There's all kinds of other cosmological stuff that probably isn't a coincidence. I mean, I heard Ben Davidson talking about around the solstice. We're just supposed to believe that the North Pole aligns with the center of the galaxy at right around the solstice. Like, it just happens to be a coincidence, right? Astronomy is scary, really scary, but I'd rather know than not know.
Yeah, that's so true. And again, that's going to be an arrow in your quiver, is having knowledge of why these changes are occurring versus coming at it with fear. Because as I've been saying all along about the wake up of the general populace coming across the planet, is going to occur later at the end of this year, sometime in 2020. You know how the human populace reacts to stimulus? They're more on the fear base than the knowledge base. But if you really understand what's going on, you can also understand that there's ways to mitigate, prepare for this, get ready, and you're going to survive these changes because we're still here. These cyclic patterns of building of societies into the apex of art, technology, mathematics, and everything in between. And then we come into these darker ages where it seems that the progress for the previous generations or civilizations are set back, or there's at least a stagnation. Well, this is what we're coming into, because if there's not enough food on the planet to feed everybody, there's just going to be lower productivity in general due to economy and all these interwoven facets. Because if food rises 4x and you're literally paying 4 times more for your food, the other disposable money that you would spend out for movies, electronics, travel, and whatever it is that you do with your extra money is going to disappear into a certain sector. So the general economy is going to deflate on one side, but it's going to hyperinflate on the food processing and that vertical stream over there, what's happening with agriculture and anything into the supermarkets. And, you know, if you know what's happening, you can definitely prepare for this. And that's another reason that I want to bring you on today to talk about some of the solutions and, you know, just get better knowledge so you're not scared and you can explain it to somebody else in a layman's, easy to understand terms of what's going on. So if they ask, you can explain it.
I say it all the time. Even if you don't have any capacity to do anything to prepare, if you can't afford a bug out bag, and let's say you live in the city someplace, I don't know, in Indonesia or someplace that's right in the middle of our daily earthquake watch zone, just the idea that you might be involved in a 6 or 7 magnitude earthquake, stepping out the front door and looking up and see if there's going to be a possible gargoyle falling on your head that weighs 7,000 pounds or not, can make a huge difference. You know, just the idea that you're going to panic a little bit less than somebody that you're trying to save because you had some idea something was going to happen. So I think it's in everybody's best interest to get a little bit out of their comfort zone at least. I'm a crappy gardener. That's why I'm growing tomatoes and garlic and other stuff inside the house. I had enough foresight last year before the frost came in. I saw some tomatoes that were sprouting in our compost area. So I was like, well, if they can grow in that low light region, I guess I might as well just bring them in the house and not let them get frosted over. And as a result of that, I'll get, I think I got 4 or 5 tomatoes going now. So I'll get at least 4 or 5 tomatoes worth of seeds. And that's a huge deal because now those seeds will be, you know, they'll be epigenetically predisposed to growing where I want them to grow with, you know, just LED lights inside the house. And I'll also have a huge head start when the late spring comes this year, like it did last year. Hopefully Canada won't be half frozen into May like it was last year. And, you know, there's a lot of other stuff too. Like, for instance, Russia has just created a ministry to consider the idea of not exporting wheat. And as soon as food starts driving prices up, everybody's Google stock is getting sold real fast. All that stuff is a bubble economy, speculative investment, bought with cheap money, created by the Federal Reserve. That's the first stuff to go away. It's speculative investments are gone as soon as you're hungry.
Yeah, I'll agree. And all we have to do is take a repeat look at 2008, 9, and 10. You know, what's on our doorstep is going to be the exact same thing, but this time there'll be no quantitative easing. There'll be no stimulus money, because what the Fed can't control is food prices. They can pretty much control everything else, but, you know, that is the Achilles heel of the Fed is the actual food pricing. You know, they steal 2% from our wages every year through inflation, but the food is uncontrollable, literally. So when you think about that as the only facet that they really cannot control due to demand drive, they can't print that away. You're hungry every day, period.
Speaking of which, before I forget to ask you about it, we just recently have started trying to do some other things here to get a little healthier. Now, I am a pro cyclist who's unable to retire. But besides that, you know, we've been making other little tweaks, doing things like switching certain things to organic, like one at a time to see if there's any effects. And we recently switched to organic coffee, and we thought that there was quite a bit of a difference there in that coffee beans are like the most highly pesticided crop in the world, right?
So what'd you feel? What'd you find? What was the difference?
I noticed that when I switched to like an organic coffee, that I didn't feel jittery. I still felt maybe slightly energized, but I associated with coffee with feeling jittery. And when I switched to organic coffee, I don't feel jittery anymore. So do you think that was pesticide like glyphosate or mycotoxin, or any ideas on that one? Because that was kind of odd. I wasn't expecting such a noticeable difference. It also tasted milder.
Yeah, what I like to do is mix coconut oil with my coffee because the coffee speeds through you, but the coconut oil grabs and bonds to the molecule and allows it to last much longer in your system. So that caffeine bonds to the coconut oil, the molecules itself. So as the fat burns, it burns the caffeine with it. So I find if I have coconut oil combined with the coffee, that same kind of extended, and then I'll drop in some L-theanine and a few other nootropics in there, to keep that firing off. Just real simple one, natural stack with the coffee, L-theanine, maybe some vinpocetine and ginkgo or something.
How crucial do you think it is to drink organic coffee instead of like Maxwell House?
I don't drink Maxwell House. I used to trade coffee out of Myanmar. That's the whole reason I started my channel. For those of you who don't know, the inception of Adapt 2030. Yeah, let me throw the story out for everybody. David DuByne here. I used to be a coffee buyer in Myanmar, otherwise known as Burma, back when the British controlled it. Now, this is a tropical area on the planet. Where we were buying coffee was a little further up on what they call Pinoluin area, about 1,000 meters up. But we used to export coffee out of there. And what the coffee farmers were telling us that they had cold weather damage for the previous 2 years. So I started first going down there around 2012, just when they were opening up. And we exported coffee for about 2 years out of there, and cold damage every single year. And the reason I was even ran into John Casey's work was we were doing a allocation forecast to see if we could expand our business, because you have to prepay the farmers to put the plantings out in the field. If you're going to get expansion for your tonnage coming in, you have to prepay for that, and then they plant everything. But the problem was they were losing about 14% or so, 13, 14, 12% of new plantings every year due to cold damage.
Wasn't 2012 the hottest year ever?
Eva was 98, I think.
All right. Just checking.
It was really a red flag because I used to believe in global warming. I really did. I watched all the Al Gore movies. I saw that stuff. The Inconvenient Truth, and I was into it. And save the planet, save the whales, save the seals.
Sure,
I believe that too. Get the pollution. I don't like plastics in our ocean.
Yeah, I agree. But I'm not like in the pocket of big oil or anything,
No, but Dan, seriously, that I couldn't find the answers because I was thinking about, all right, if it's cold damage, I got to look for reasons they're cold, because I was told it was global warming. We got places in Burma here, Myanmar, that are cooling every single year. So I reached out to John Casey, and then I found his work, and then we conversed a few times, and it was game on from that point. I'm like, you know what? Everything I've been told has been a lie. Everything I've been told is a mistruth. And I couldn't figure it out as why. And then more information came in about the global tax scheme and the control and, putting people into more dense habitation zones and controlling through smart grids and smart cities what we can consume in terms of resources. But that's a whole nother rabbit hole in itself. But the whole coffee buying thing in Myanmar is the reason I even started the channel, because the cold damage didn't make sense down there to me. And it shouldn't to you listeners either. Cold damage in Burma on the coffee plantations and the coffee farms is not what we were told would happen in global warming, but it did, and it still persists to this day. The bean density is lower. The top kill on the leaves is increasing every year. They actually have to plant much more. They're planting up to 20% new plantings, know that they're going to get knocked back to about 15.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, so if you want to put out 20 new acres, you need to put out 25.
Oh,
so you
wow.
Get down to 20, right? This is what's happening down there in Myanmar still. And Thailand is the same way. I took some trips to Thailand to source out some coffee, and Laos as well. They're all experiencing Southeast Asia that same exact thing. It's killing the smaller plantings and damaging the bean, the density, and the leaves on the more mature plants, 4, 5, 7 years or something.
What about the possibility that the North Pole is moving in that direction? Do you think that's responsible? Because when you have poles, you tend to get colder air around the poles because of the way water behaves, and that affects the rest of the atmosphere. Is that the reasoning behind why there's increased cold damage in that area, or do you think it's something else?
Well, it's an interesting thing that you said, because the polar wander that's happening Now, everybody's saying, oh, look, it's since the 1600s, the North Pole is migrating toward Kamchatka Peninsula area in Russia. But if you look back at the poles or the magnetic poles that they've mapped out since the year 200 AD, if you go back to 200 AD, you find the pole almost in the exact same trajectory and position it should be in about 4 or 5 years from now. If it continues in that direction, clipping along faster and faster each year, it'll end up pretty much in that same area over physical Russia. It's going off the water straight over into Russia, west of the Kamchatka Peninsula. And if that's where it was in 200 AD, and then it flipped back and moved around the North Pole to where it is now, and it's going back to the same place. It's almost like it's a 2,000-year cycle we're into. TrueLeafMarket.com. I really want to talk about growing your own food, which will be a necessity moving forward. There's so many ways that we can go about growing different types of vegetables that we're going to need. You know, microgreens are incredibly nutritious. They're super fast to grow. In less than a week, you can have something that you can eat. Also, sprouts. We can get those a little bit taller, a little more dense, a little bit larger volume on the vegetation mass coming off of there. So how do you know what kind of sprouts to grow? How about wheatgrass or herbs? What about different types of herbs that we can add to our foods? Now, what I just described to you, there's a full range of starter guides there at TrueLeafMarket.com for you to take a look at. Even if it's just for your own knowledge and you don't purchase something from them, at least get the information so you know how to grow microgreens, you know how to grow sprouts, you understand what some of the herbs are for. TrueLeafMarket.com. Use the link below and give yourself the gift of organic and heirloom seeds. Versus a 400-year. That's why I keep talking about a more powerful cycle at times, because the magnetic pole seems to be mimicking or repeating a cycle once again.
Yeah, and that's a question I get on my channel all the time. You know, when do you predict the Earth's pole flip is going to happen? And oh man, talk about a tough question to answer. You know, that requires a paragraph-long answer with like 1,000 words, because it's like, well, first of all, I think it'll happen during a solar polar field flip. That seems to only make sense, because I'm not somebody who believes in an internal dynamo inside of the Earth. I don't believe that is there. You got to show me observational evidence to believe that that's a thing. And so if you don't believe that there's an internal dynamo inside of the Earth, then there's obviously something external powering the magnetosphere. You don't need moving parts. All you really need is moving electrons to get all of the features that we see happening. And those go through stuff. So, and they go around things. You don't need an ocean of iron underneath the planet to do that. But if that's the case, then what causes the sun to do it? Well, it's probably something external to the sun too. Is it a different galaxy? Is there any way we can predict it? So that's part of the reason why we try to tie together the cosmic rays. There's another possibility that the cosmic rays and the solar activity are correlated. Perhaps it's not a causational relationship. You can't say for sure that it is. Trying to crunch all the variables, man, but it gets a little bit tough sometimes. And I got to say, the level of responsibility on my channel keeps going up because people keep asking harder and harder questions. It's been quite a journey. And frankly, we're hoping we see a stronger cycle 25. If you suggest cycle 25 is going to be stronger, there are people that are going to flip out on you about it. Not that I care if anybody flips out, because that happens to me all the time. By the way, I don't work for the CIA, if you were wondering. All of my training is private, none by any government ever.
If I could interject there, Dan, nor I don't work for big oil. Everybody accuses me on the green side of working for big oil. I've never taken a dime from big oil. Never have. It's my own opinion too of things are changing naturally.
Yeah, when I was a day trader in 2000, 2001, actually 99 through 2002, I'll say, I kept oil stocks out of my portfolio because I didn't understand the economy back then. Since then, fortunately, I did learn about it because I understood the Federal Reserve. That was the little piece that I was missing. Once I understood how that relates in such an unfortunate way to the rest of the economy, it kind of all made sense after that. But man, talk about a rabbit hole. Why do you keep forecasting the sun, Dan? It's because the sun's part of the economy.
Yeah, and it truly is. And, what we talk about here with the sun in itself is not going to set civilization back. the problem is the food or lack thereof is going to push us back, a civilization reset button. All these variables, the IPCC says, oh, the climate science is settled. Well, it's not, because even just last year, they're adding in different kind of cloud vapor loops down in the southern hemisphere that they magically just discovered or forgot that they added. You're telling me you forgot cloud vapor down? Are you kidding me?
Yeah,
so
really.
All these variables out there, how many more variables can we discover? And here's the rabbit hole issue too, is we're going to learn so much about the sun and what happens in these next few years, because we have an incredible, technology and electronics, satellites to measure this, take a look at it.
And the proper solar probe also is a good one.
Yeah, there's probes, satellites, counters, everything in between. But you really have to wonder, the previous civilizations and societies, as we go back through history, as we go back through different ice ages, back hundreds of thousands of years, they were, according to the legends, incredibly advanced. And what knowledge did they have that they had either encoded in stelae and different types of temple iconography that has been hidden from us? So you almost need to think over the last 500 years, as the conquistadors and different raiders of civilizations went around, they took the best back, and it's in private libraries, etc. I am sure they have mapped this out way more in detail than anybody can imagine.
Yeah, and you look at the oldest artifacts in the world. The oldest sign of organized farming is, what is that, about 14,000 years old? Göbekli Tepe. I mean, what was up with that? I thought that it was impossible to have organized farming 14,000 years ago. That was like during a proper glaciation. So, it seems to be aligned at Deneb and not at Sagittarius, just like the pyramids, and all these things are built on top of other things. Plus, we have a geologic catastrophe cycle that, if you study geology by about 10th grade, you're going to learn that there's some crazy layer called the KT boundary where there's some kind of unexplainable catastrophe that occurred on the Earth not all that long ago. So it would really behoove mankind to figure out all that stuff, get it out to everybody, so that resources could be allocated appropriately instead of the way they are now, because resources are allocated horrendously badly.
I would agree, but as we have the discussion here, it's the greatest opportunity in human history, at least in terms of this iteration of it. There's more wealth, technology, communication, connectiveness at this point in human history than we've ever had. So
I think
there's more opportunity. So when we look at this as a huge problem that needs to be fixed, we can also look at the amount of opportunity as something exponential, because it's going to be implemented everywhere, in every continent, every city, every place on this planet is going to need the same type of fixed tech to bring everything indoors for vertical farming or whatever it is. I don't know, rotary drums, anything we could do to grow food. It's all going to have to migrate that way, and the amount of investment capital with it's going to just trail and lead it right in there. So it is a huge, huge opportunity if you can see what's in the future and understand that this money is going to be redirected somewhere else.
Exactly. And oh, by the way, before I forget, I wanted to let you know about this this growing system that I came up with here, a free way to sprout and grow small plants like seedlings inside. So have you ever seen, I don't know if you have this in Myanmar. Are you always in Myanmar, or do you head back to the US sometimes? We recently also switched to organic eggs because that's a huge deal. Eggs are a big part of the diet, and they're pretty cheap. So it's, can't really afford to do everything organic all the time, but certain stuff you want to make a priority out of it, right? Well, we noticed these eggs from Lancaster here. I'm in Eastern Pennsylvania, by the way. They're just, let's see, Noah's Pride brand cage-free organic brown eggs, right? Well, they come in this container that's it's like a clamshell. So it's like three pieces. You got the bottom and the top of the clamshell that's egg-shaped. And then there's also a clear plastic lid that goes off of that. You can easily pull the label out of the top of it. And these things are like micro greenhouses. I gotta put a video of this once I plant something in it. It's such a waste to recycle these things when you can use it to grow plants. They're a little more expensive, but if you figure the benefit that you get from the organic eggs instead of the mass-produced factory farm eggs, and you're using it as it's like a miniature greenhouse, man. You got to see these things. It's amazing. It's made out of this perfect clear plastic. You could even have these things outside and close the lid, and it would survive a hailstorm. Trying to come up with new and innovative routes to accomplish a lot with a little, the way any mountain biker would.
Yeah, or any hiker, anybody in a situation where you know you need to provide for yourself if something goes wrong and breaks down. You know, athletes and persons in the outdoor, even if it's recreational outdoor, scuba divers, whatever it is, if there's something that comes up that's unplanned, at least you're more in the mind frame of being able to solve these problems. So if we can take that to a wider scale and interject it into this next decade, okay, there's something huge coming. Your tire just went flat. Oh, how are you going to fix that thing? All right. Whatever we're throwing away now, this is where you get into these stories of your grandparents saving everything from the Great Depression, right? They were trying to work the same magic of don't throw anything away. We could possibly reuse it for something. And you got to think, if it was that bad in the 1930s when there were only 6 times less people on the planet, what's it going to be like when happens during this time when there's almost 8 billion people on? Because during the Great Depression, there were 1.5, 1.6 billion people on the planet during that time?
Must have been something like that, yeah.
Yeah, in the 1930s. So think about where we're going to go. If it was that bad back then when there was enough game to hunt, everybody knew how to farm, everybody knew how to hunt, trap, fish, people knew how to repair their own, people knew how to sew their own clothing, make their own clothing, repair everything, and they still struggled. So what's it going to be like now when very few people know how to do much of anything? This video is brought to you by our friends at TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds for any grow zone on our planet.